what I want to do in this panel is to draw together some of the disparate themes that were mentioned during the course of this conference, and also take a look ahead to what we might expect in the Indian marketplace in the next 2 to 3 years. And our panelists today are well placed to comment and provide insight on these themes. Mr. Peshwal has experience not only in government as the Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia and Central Asian Affairs in the last part of the second half of the Obama administration, but also is now president of the U.S.-India Business Council, which is part of the U.S. Chamber, and she leads a prominent business association focused on India. Ravi Tilak is president of Almex USA, a locally based company that does business around the world, including in India, and you also work very closely with one of the largest business houses in India as well. Yes. So, with that said, let's get started. I was struck the morning session where you mentioned, you repeated an observation that you picked up when you were in Los Angeles earlier this year, that Southern California businesses are overinvested in China and underinformed on India. And I wonder, do you find that to be true for U.S. businesses in general? Are there misapprehensions that have caused U.S. companies to miss market opportunities?
Yeah, India? Absolutely. I think India is changing dramatically and rapidly, but India is not new for most American companies. In some ways, that is what I think keeps American companies from diving in, which is that the first experience many American companies had with India did not end well. It may have been 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, but it was not a happy ending, and so they've been more cautious about re-engaging with India. But in fact, the India of today is nothing like the India of 15 years ago. And that's why I say that Americans need to renew their acquaintance with India.
I was struck, a quick anecdote from 3 years ago. I was struck that at that time a new CEO of Procter & Gamble came on board, and he publicly admitted his company was losing market share in India, and he had no idea that Chinese consumer marketplace was changing so rapidly that Procter & Gamble was blindsided. A month later, the CEO of Unilever came out and said the same thing. We have no idea what's going on, why things are changing so quickly in China. And I wonder if that same sort of lack of understanding is true for U.S. companies that are involved in India. Ravi, do you find that U.S. companies in general don't understand market dynamics in India?
No. Any U.S. company that is interested in doing overseas business equips itself quite adequately with knowledge of the culture, with the knowledge of the politics, and with the bandwidth of the general labor force which is available in that country. So I don't think it's related to that. It's related to other market dynamics.
I agree 100%. I mean, for the companies that are invested in India, they're quite sophisticated about their knowledge of the domain in which they are invested. So the Unilevers, the Procter & Gambles, the Coca-Colas, the Boeings, they're all quite sophisticated. I think where there is perhaps a lack of knowledge or underinformed is on those who are not yet really engaged in India and are starting to think and look in that direction. And that's where I think there are still a lot of misapprehensions. Those who are there are doing well. even if they're encountering some challenges here and there, they're there because they're doing well.
For companies that are looking to enter the Indian marketplace, what is the largest misapprehension that they need to be disabused of?
Well, I mean, I think that it is daunting. There's not a single entry, point. There's not a single window necessarily approach to India, right? And so, and it's not a command economy where if you go and you meet with the head of state or you meet with, the prince or that's it, your space is completely secured. You have to navigate a broad, diverse, complex system. And so there are ways to do that, but for many companies, they're looking for shortcuts. And India is not really prone to many shortcuts in a sustainable way. Ravi, you might elaborate on that.
Yeah, there are two aspects to it. You have to talk from a seller point of view. US companies which are trying to sell into India, either technology or their cargo, their products. And for them, it's the receivable security is the most important thing. And I'll tell you what's going on with the Indian system. In order to control the currency, they keep a tight hold on their banking system. So for a US exporter to secure the payment for its product, is going to ask for a letter of credit from the buyer within India. That letter of credit will have to be confirmed by his banker in US. Now, most of the Indian suppliers are very comfortable dealing with State Bank of India. And they will therefore open a letter of credit on State Bank of India, which has to be confirmed by the State Bank in USA. That is where one problem arises. Now, if you are looking other side of the equation of doing business with India, which is if you are a buyer out of India, what is the security for your cargo, that the cargo will be released when you have made the payment? So basically, the hurdles are on financial side and on the understanding side and the machineries that the governments have put in place do not make trade easier. Forget the infrastructure and forget everything else, forget the culture and all that. But if the money flow is eased, if the money flow channels are kept well lubricated, business happens. And that's what China did. They kept freedom. Bank of China, Industrial and Commercial Development Bank of China, any bank in China which opens a letter of credit, which is a guarantee to the supplier from US, can be confirmed at any at the counters of any major US bank. So if the currency transactions and the money exchanges are kept well secured, well intact, easy, in the sense well lubricated, business happens very fast.
Is there a single piece of advice, what should US companies looking to enter India, what's the single piece of advice they should keep foremost in their mind? Is there one? From my point of view, perhaps one could say, you need to take the long view. US companies, their time horizon usually extends to the next quarter. And I've had some Indian entrepreneurs come to me and say, we actually prefer Chinese partners because they take the long view and they actually have relevant knowledge for building a business in a developing market. So taking the long view might be one piece of advice. Is there another?
I mean, definitely taking the long view, being tenacious, being resilient. And India, what I say is, you can't just have one touch point. You really have to engage in a very multiplicity of ways. Oftentimes, when I'm talking to companies, when they're trying to affect policy in the United States, they have a very sophisticated approach to affecting policy in the United States. You build your coalitions, you engage your stakeholders, you seek to influence your policymakers, you do marketing, you do, coalition building, and then you go to another country and you want to affect the policy environment. You want a meeting with the prime minister or the chief minister, and you want a resolution of the issue. And then if you don't get it in 3 weeks or 3 months, you're very frustrated that you haven't been able to get what you wanted, even though you met with the big guy. And it's just simply not the way it works, right? India is the same kind of extremely complicated and multifaceted democracy that the United States is, with a multiplicity of actors and influencers, with central government, state government, independent regulators, local municipalities, with a very robust media environment, a very robust nonprofit advocacy environment, and you have to be able to navigate all of that to create the regulatory policy environment that you want to create. And so having the long view and having, putting in the resources and the effort to shape that environment in a holistic way, which is what we try to do through the U.S.-India Business Council.
Ravi, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yes. What is important when you go to start changing policies of other governments, right, or to lobby for that, is to know why those policies have come into existence. And if you become cognizant of that factor, then it becomes easy for you to navigate yourself. For example, as Nisha was saying, India is a very complex structure. I call it, it's a composite structure consisting of India, which is a collection of 50 major cities, tier 1, tier 2, even tier 3 cities. And the rest of the landmass is Bharat. Bharat is another ancient name for India. So what happens is Bharat elects politicians. They come and start ruling from India. They are aware of what policies have to be implemented in order to rescue Bharat from its current position. But they are ruling from within India. That becomes difficult. So it is very important that this aspect cannot be overlooked by any foreign company wanting to do business in India, is understand why the policies are the way they are. Because the policies have been made for a composite structure of masses. Let me give you a simple analogy to this. If countries are very large entities, look at a family. If there is a family where there are 5 children, and one has polio, unfortunately, suppose, one has blindness in the eye, one is autistic, one is okay, and one is very efficient in sports. The parents will have very difficult time to formulate policies within the family's working, within the family's governance, to keep the family together, to keep everybody happy. So there will be give and take in terms of how each entity is to be addressed in order to keep the self-esteem of the whole group together, alive, and make progress. India is like this today. So the policy maker's viewpoint has to be understood by a foreigner wanting to do business there. Once that is done, the rest of the course becomes easier.
You touch on the politics of economic reform in India. I wonder, in your view, do U.S. businesses understand this, that reform is, we hear that India is the next China, and I wonder if a lot of U.S. companies, particularly those new to India, come with the mindset that, all right, the next China, if economic reform is desired, if there must be political will and it can be implemented quickly, and we find over and over that's not the case, and as a result, there's this cycle, it seems to me, a great deal of expectations about the Indian marketplace, followed by great disappointment. New government comes in, great expectations, followed by, that is quickly tempered by disappointment. I wonder if that is part of the mindset that U.S. companies, particularly those new to India.
So first, let me just take issue with the India is the next China meme, because I don't think India is the next China. I don't think India wants to be the next China. I think India is the next India, right? It's going to be the India version of, you know, growth, and not the China version of growth. And it's going to look very different in India. And I think the Indians recognize that. And so you don't see very many people in India saying that they're aspiring to be the next China. Secondly, I don't think that American industry is monolithic in its approach or its understanding. And you see certain companies that have, as I said, a very nuanced understanding of the ecosystem, and others less so, and some in between, where the India leadership in the company knows exactly what's going on and how, but are also navigating pressure from headquarters and pressure from shareholders that don't have the long view, right? They're looking at quarterly earnings reports, and they're looking at, you know, market share, and they're under a lot of pressures. The India team will understand that this is not going to get resolved in 2 months, that this is going to take a longer, you know, and more patient approach, but don't necessarily have that connect. So some companies have the long view and manage that. Some companies are feeling more pressure and have less room to manage that. And in all of that, I say you need both. You need the push and the pull. You need to have that pressure of investors, of shareholders kind of pushing to show progress, because that pressure also helps yield some positive outcomes. But at the same time, then you also have to have the patient approach of allowing that pressure to then actually take effect and show result.
The American thinking style is more individualistic, you know. There is a Japanese proverb which says that if you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go far, you go with others. The entire American psyche, and therefore corporate psyche, is also to be self-sufficient and self-reliant as much as you can be. When entering difficult regimes, regime in the sense difficult countries for business growth, you have to go with others, meaning you have to find a JV partner within India who knows the ways and the regulations, and they give you legs on the ground. So if that due diligence is done, a lot of American companies will find it easier to enter India. And I suppose that's one of the charters of our chamber, is to make handshakes as many as possible by making either they invest here or American companies invest there, but not independently, with a local partner.
Let's take a look at the Indian economy. India is the fastest growing major economy in the world. Do you expect that to continue over the next 2 to 3 years? What will be the major drivers of that economic growth? And will we start to see the benefits of the major tax overhaul that was implemented last year?
So India has been growing at somewhere between 7% and 8% growth. I think the last quarter went to 8.2%. They're probably expecting a slight dip in the next quarter to like 7.9%. Prime Minister has projected that he hopes within the next couple years that they'll start hitting double-digit growth. I don't know if they're going to be right at double-digit because they really do need to create more streamlining, more efficiencies, really push forward on the economic reforms and really start bringing in a much more investment to be able to hit double-digit growth. That said, I think for an economy the size of India, even as it's growing at the clip that it is, that represents extraordinary opportunity. And as you see this growing middle class in India, which means that the consumer class in India is growing, the consumption is growing as you have more affluent Indians then upping their spending, and so that creates more markets for more and more products, right? So I see that as, again, major drivers of opportunity for U.S. investment into India. You also see more and more new businesses starting up in India. And growth in the SME sector is, I think, another area, because so much of the private equity that's going into India is going into scaling up Indian enterprises. And so I think that that's going to continue to be an important area. Infrastructure is the big need of the hour in terms of both what India needs as infrastructure and what infrastructure needs as investment. The challenge has been to draw in private investment into building up that infrastructure because it has been such a difficult and unpredictable area of investment. You now have a U.S. administration that is really trying to focus on that. In that Congress passed the BUILD Act. OPIC, Overseas Private Insurance Corporation, now has double the amount of financing capital that it did. It went from $30 billion to $60 billion. It now has the ability to provide equity lending into foreign markets. And so I think that you're going to start to see the U.S. administration take on a more robust role in trying to provide development finance, infrastructure finance in the Indo-Pacific. And that might create more opportunities both for private capital and for the infra companies to go in. So I see these as growth opportunities coming forward.
Ravi, would you like to add anything? And particularly, is there a major opportunity in the Indian marketplace that you think U.S. companies have not noticed?
Yes, there are. This is a large subject, but on the first question is the growth is happening, as Nisha mentioned. Definitely it's happening. And it's happening because the government policies are allowing more wider, newer income streams to come into existence. The real growth happens, when you are able to add to the entire business sector newer income streams. Otherwise, it's just the expansion of the business, which is then dependent on so many factors, including currency conversion rates, oil prices, especially for countries like India. Oil is of paramount importance. It determines, India's balance sheet is determined by oil price today, because they have to be importing oil all the time by shelling out dear foreign exchange, So the policies that Modi government has implemented now through Aadhaar Card Yojana and through making banking easy and collecting their own tax revenues through GSTs in a very collectible, meaning the implementation of GST is happening fabulously. So all these things are allowing newer income streams to come into existence. And that is why I feel India is on a solid growth path.
Our time is winding down. Two quick questions. What is the number one thing that you would advise the Indian government to do in order to be more welcoming to foreign business? And is there any single piece of advice you would give the Trump administration regarding how to enhance U.S.-India economic ties?
Two great questions, not small. If I were to, advise the Indian government on where it should set its gaze and its ambition, I would say right now you have tremendous pressure that it's being exerted on the U.S.-China trade relationship. And whether you agree or disagree with that policy, the consequence of that is that a number of companies that have their supply chains sourced out of China are thinking about whether they need to diversify and move those supply chains. Is India going to make a play for that? If you have a Modi administration prioritizing Make in India, are you creating the kind of manufacturing policy that's going to draw those supply chains into India? And I think if I were to advise the Modi government, I would say take a hard look at what it is that has drawn so much manufacturing, not only into China, but into Southeast Asia, and say, what is it that India can do to really bring more of that manufacturing base into India? If I were to advise the current administration in the United States, looking at India, I would say this seems somewhat counterintuitive, which is that India is a difficult country with which to have a trading relationship, in the sense that we don't have any kind of a trade architecture. We don't have a bilateral investment treaty or a free trade agreement of any nature. And India is not the priority country when we look at, because we don't have enough commonality. Yet I think that for the future of U.S. economic growth and prosperity, Asia is going to be extraordinarily important, and within Asia, India is going to be extraordinarily important. So I would say creating the framework to start that conversation, even if it takes you 5 years or 10 years to get to that point, I think you got to walk down that road.
Do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, I think I will also suggest that U.S. administration should eavesdrop to the Indian policymakers to get in bed with China. That is the best way to bring the manufacturing sector that is existent in China and start bringing part of that to India. Unless, why I say that is because there is enormous overcapacity built in China. Enormous overcapacity in each sector of industry. And that capacity could be brought partly under Indian ownership. That is one way. Or second way is to make an industrial transplantation. It's not very difficult. It happened from US to Taiwan to Korea to Japan. Then it happened from Japan, Korea, Taiwan to Malaysia, Thailand, and China. So similarly, from those countries, it needs to happen to India. That's the way sourcing and supply chains keep moving into geographies of the world where the assets are more productive, more utilizable, and more cost-friendly. Our interest here is to keep our living costs as low as possible. That's the administration's #1 interest, And in order to do that, obviously, developing overseas supply chains is important. So my suggestion, one of the suggestions, is US should eavesdrop to India, do more business with China, and that way bring it over.
Yeah, I don't know if I would agree with that. And I don't think that the administration would either. I think, though, that India can do more to attract that business than it is doing currently.
And what about advice to the Indian government? One piece of advice.
The advice to the Indian government is clean up your act in terms of the looks, in terms of make your citizens more quality conscious in every respect, and make it loudly and clearly so that the rest of the world also hears it, that there is a problem, but you are addressing the problem head on, and then loosen these banking channels without losing control of the currency. You can manipulate your currency and keep the currency closed, meaning, you can't buy dollars just like that in the Indian market openly. But at least give more conduits and leave those conduits free and open for transactions of money.
Well, that's well timed. We are in the very final seconds of our session. I wonder if just one closeout question. Is there, besides your own company, is there any company doing business in India that you think is an exemplar that other companies could learn from?
You mean American companies?
American companies.
Yes, the agricultural companies, not the Monsanto types, but the agricultural equipment companies are doing very good business in India. Very good.
And why is that?
It's because they have understood what the Indian farmer needs. And they are making equipment utilizing his needs. They are making equipment knowing where the Indian government is giving subsidy to those farmers in buying what type of equipment. So they are setting up manufacturing plants in India and making this equipment. And it is really doing a marvelous benefit to the American company as well as to the end beneficiary.
Yeah. Do you have anything to add?
I mean, I don't know that I could single out any one company, but I would just say that we have some of the most impressive and recognizable of American brands that are present in India, and likewise some of the highest caliber of Indian brands that are present in America. And I think both are adding tremendous value, not just the economic impact, but also what they are adding in terms of the social impact that they're generating in both countries.